When it comes to emulation handhelds, it's not every day I come across one that I can call truly unique. While there are so many great devices to choose from, certainly more now than ever before, it's not a secret that many of them are clearly derivations of each other. Whenever a device does exceedingly well, there's always another company ready and waiting to release a copycat version of their own. I love all the Miu Minis and 35XXs that are available nowadays, but reviewing and comparing them can really feel like splitting hairs. They're simply more similar than they are different, and if you're happy with one, you'll likely be happy with any of them. Then, every once in a while, a handheld shows up that truly separates itself from the pack. One that feels different, looks different, and excels in ways that the other devices simply can't match. One that, in all likelihood, will eventually inspire its own slew of copycats. A true game changer. This is the Powkiddy RGB30. At first glance, the RGB30 might not look very special. It's a pretty typical rectangular handheld with a horizontal layout. It's around 6 inches wide and about 3 to 4 inches tall, and weighs in just around 210 grams. You've got a standard button layout, 4 face buttons, 4 shoulder buttons, a D-pad, and 2 analog sticks. The face and shoulder buttons both feel decent, nothing egregious to complain about. Actually, I've always been a fan when buttons have the markings engraved on their surface, just like you would see on the face buttons of a Gameboy Color, so bonus points for that. The texture, size, and travel distance all suit me just fine, but to be honest, I've never been particularly picky about buttons. The D-pad, though, is another story. My RGB30 is quite prone to false diagonals, meaning that when I hold down on the D-pad, if my thumb shifts just a little bit, there's a good chance I'll start activating the left or right directions. It's annoying and caused more than a few blunders while playing Tetris, but can be easily resolved by opening up your device and adding some Kapton tape to mask part of the button contacts. I'll drop a guide on how to do that in the description down below. When you get the RGB30 in your hands, you're bound to notice a few things, both positive and negative. Let's start with what I don't like, and to be honest, it's a bit nitpicky. The device feels kind of cheap. I wish I could be a little more precise as to why that is, but it's hard to really pinpoint what makes me feel that way. It could be the weight, or the quality of the plastic, maybe a combination of both, I'm not really sure. And to be fair, this is a sub $100 device, and for that price you're getting an absolutely incredible package of features that we'll get into shortly. If I compare it to something like the Retroid Pocket 2S, the 2S just has a more premium vibe to it. It's a bit more sturdy, has better quality plastic, some vibration motors which add a little bit of weight, and some really satisfying shoulder triggers. The RGB30, on the other hand, has something that you won't find on any other handheld in this price range, and that something is the incredible, massive, 4-inch 720p 1:1 aspect ratio LCD screen. Other comparable devices like the Pocket 2S or RG35XX are only equipped with 3.5-inch 4x3 480p screens. Now, don't be fooled into thinking that the RGB30 screen is just half an inch bigger. Because of the difference in aspect ratio, this actually makes the screen 30% larger than the other devices. Additionally, the resolution is 51% higher, and the pixels per inch end up being 21% more than the competition. No matter which metric you choose to focus on, the difference is significant. And trust me when I say that you can definitely feel the difference. The screen just appears enormous in your hands. The colors are great, it's bright, vibrant, and because of the high 720p resolution, you're able to appreciate some very attractive pixel grid LCD shaders. Many others have compared it to the display on the Analog Pocket, which makes sense as they're similar in a lot of ways. The Pocket has a 10:9 aspect ratio, which is just about as close as you can get to the square 1:1 aspect ratio of the RGB30. The Analog Pocket does fall behind the RGB30 in terms of overall size. It's about 24% smaller, but it does boast more than double the resolution and 141% more pixels per inch. It's a bit of a toss-up, but I still consider the Analog Pocket screen to be the absolute best in class. And this is totally fine, because we have to remember that you can easily purchase the RGB30 for less than half the price of an Analog Pocket. And the fact that we can even reasonably compare the RGB30 to the Pocket is pretty crazy when you consider that massive price difference. Now, are there downsides to the screen? Sure. It's not a touchscreen like some other devices have, so playing DS games isn't a perfect experience. But when you add in everything else, Wi-Fi, HDMI out, Bluetooth controller support, and the ability to play DS, PSP, N64, and Dreamcast games reasonably well, all for $80 with free shipping from the Powkiddy official store, and best of all, it comes in a wide array of colors. I don't know, it's really hard to recommend anything else in this price range. When it comes to the software experience, there are some pretty decent Linux-based options. And when I say decent, I mean it, because I haven't really had a great experience with either Gelos or ArcOS. Both use Emulation Station as their front end, which I'm a huge fan of, but Gelos has the far better theme by default, and allows you to change more of your core settings right there in the front end. ArcOS requires that you adjust your settings within the RetroArch menu of each core, and then save those settings as override files. But some other consoles require you to manually edit a configuration file, which is just too much work for me. I've heard that ArcOS has better performance for more demanding cores, but I opted not to really use it that much after it kept freezing on me and refusing to even load when turning on the device. I found it to be an ugly, frustratingly bad user experience. I recently found out that the development of Gelos has basically ended, which is quite a bummer because between the two, it was the software experience that I preferred. Now, you know that I don't do in-depth setup guides, so if you're interested in that, please check out the guide by Retro Game Core. I'll link that below, and you can also check out his channel where he has some great videos on the RGB30. Now you might still be wondering, is the RGB30 really all that great? Does the screen actually have a big impact on the games? I'm here to tell you that yes, it does. It absolutely does. I almost made the mistake of thinking that the square display would only really make for a killer Gameboy focused device. But after spending a lot of time with the RGB30, I can tell you that labeling it just as a great Game Boy player would be selling it short. Yes, Game Boy and Game Boy Color play spectacularly well on the RGB30. The 10:9 aspect ratio of these games almost perfectly fit onto the screen. If Game Boy was all you're looking for, then I have no doubt that you'll fall in love with the RGB30. And the same is true for the Neo Geo Pocket Color, another console with an almost perfectly square aspect ratio. You're probably tired of hearing me sing the praises of the Neo Geo Pocket Color at this point, but man, the more time I spend with it, the more I love it. Something I really like is that the console only has a library of 73 games, which in my opinion, makes it really approachable. Game Boy Advance and Game Gear games won't fit as neatly onto the display, but play just as you would expect on a modern emulation handheld. I don't really have any issues with the black bars on the top and bottom of the screen, because the sheer size of the RGB30 screen still provides a large, bold image for these games. Growing up, I actually owned a pretty small number of GBA games, so I don't have a ton of experience with the library. If you have some recommendations, please drop them in the comments below and I'll do my best to check them out. The Nintendo DS is a bit of a mixed bag on the RGB30. The screen size and shape makes it really great for stacking the two screens of the DS, or you can just view a single screen if that's your preference. As I mentioned before, the lack of a touchscreen makes for a less than ideal experience for some games. Instead of using a physical stylus, you have to use the right analog stick to move around a virtual stylus. Overall, I'd say that my time playing DS games on the RGB30 was enjoyable, and the lack of a touchscreen wasn't enough for me to avoid these games altogether. Once we get to the PSP, the limitations of the RGB30 start to crop up. This is where I started to notice some stuttering and slowdown with certain titles. And the 16:9 aspect ratio means that you're going to have some pretty significant black bars on the top and bottom of your games. Moving from handheld consoles to home consoles, the RGB30 continues to deliver. Nintendo and Super Nintendo are two consoles that can be played with an 8:7 aspect ratio, which almost fills up the entire display and makes the RGB30 one of the best handhelds for playing these games. Sega Genesis and the PS1, probably two of my favorite consoles of all time, both display in a 4:3 aspect ratio, which will result in some letterboxing. But again, just like with the GBA and Game Gear, the screen is so big that these black bars don't bother me. N64, Sega Saturn, and Dreamcast also have a 4:3 aspect ratio, so expect more of the same when it comes to letterboxing. It's with these games that you're going to really start to test the capabilities of the RGB30, so expect some games to perform less than perfect. I'm not going to lie, it's pretty amazing that you can play Dreamcast games on a device this cheap with a screen this nice. But as amazing as that is, the RGB30 hasn't even shown its true potential yet. Next up, I want to talk about arcade games. Now, the majority of arcade games are going to be your typical 4:3 experience. Where the RGB30 really shines is with vertical shoot-'em-ups. Like with the DS, these games can take up the entire height of the screen, making them an absolute joy to play on the RGB30. This isn't even something I would bother attempting on a 4:3 or 16:9 display. You really need that full 4-inch 1:1 screen to do these games justice. And finally, we have Pico 8. And for those of you who aren't familiar, Pico 8 is a self-described fantasy console. Basically, it's a game engine with intentionally limited audio and graphical capabilities that's meant to evoke that classic 8-bit vibe from our childhoods. Not only does Pico 8 run natively on the RGB30, but all Pico 8 games have a resolution of 128 by 128, a true 1:1 aspect ratio that will perfectly fit the screen of the RGB30. Unfortunately, we don't get perfect integer scaling, but I'm not going to complain. These games look incredible on the RGB30. I had such a great time trying out all these different Pico 8 games, which you can download directly from the device. You can really feel all the love that the indie developers poured into these games. They're both very retro and modern at the same time, so if you ever get bored emulating the same old 8-bit games, definitely give Pico 8 a try. It's like it was made for the RGB30. In a world full of derivative retro handhelds, the RGB30 is a breath of fresh air. Is it perfect? No, but it doesn't really have to be. Its success proves that there's a desire for something different. And if you don't believe that the RGB30 is making waves and changing the retro handheld landscape, well, during the making of this video, Ambernic started to tease their own horizontal, square display handheld. The copycats are on the way, and I can't wait to try them. But for now, pick up and enjoy the RGB30, and I think you'll agree that it's an absolute game changer.